Hello and welcome back for another ID Book Club meeting. We are in chapters 5 and 6 of Cathy Moore's Map It, and we're continuing on. We left off right there in the kickoff meeting, right? That's exactly where we're at. We're still in the kickoff meeting. We have established a business goal that is just so specific, so measurable, and so focused on performance. There's no doubt that we're going to find that solution. It's time for action. And that's really what this whole section is. Like, really, chapters 5 and 6 are all about the action, puts the action in the action mapping. So we'll spend some time on all of that. But as we're considering it, we have our goal written in the middle of the map as we're thinking back to what we looked at chapters 3 and 4 last week. But with that goal, that clearly, specifically written goal that's measurable, that's targeted, that's the target. In the center of our map, now we need to branch off and determine what actions are going to be crucial to that. And so Cathy Moore reminds us that instead of approaching things from that traditional way, that traditional method of focusing on what people supposedly need to know, instead of considering that, she wants us to focus instead on this. Put quite simply, we're going to focus relentlessly on what people need to do, not what they need to know. Right? That's going to be the goal. That's going to be the focus, focusing relentlessly on what they need to do, the actions. And as simple as that sounds, that's going to help avoid this course situation that we might, fall into a trap with. We don't want that to happen because, Cathy would have some words for us there. But as we're considering a couple other ideas here, Cathy gives us some tips on inspiring discussions that really go beyond like knowledge gaps, that go beyond just this focus on what they need to know. How do we figure out those actions? In fact, what does she mean by actions? What is an action according to what we saw there in chapters 5 and 6 of Map It? She gives a really helpful example. And again, if you've read, you'll remember some of these verbs I'm about to put up on the screen, because when we talk about actions, we might see those as something observable, right? But observable behaviors. But even if a behavior is observable, Cathy argues that it may not be the most helpful, right? Like, check out this list, for example. I took this straight from her section there, the first example she gives. We could throw out a verb like identify. You could see people point to things, and that could be observable. Listing, writing things down, that's an observable action as well. Describing, verbally speaking, that could be an observable action. Extinguish, and if you read the book, you'll see why that's kind of funny to have up there, but at the same time, they're going to be more helpful. And define, you can have someone define something as well. But even because all of those verbs are observable, does not necessarily mean they're going to actually increase performance on the job. And so in that list, the one that Cathy points to being the most helpful of all is not identify, list, describe, or define, but it's actually extinguish, because it's very specific to trying to put out some brush fire, training firefighters to put out a brush fire. Well, you can see that on the job. Quickly extinguish a brush fire. That action is something that you would see on the job. And so that kind of observable behavior, action, performance is what we might need to be trying to solve, not so much identify, list, describe, and all that good stuff there. So identifying what an action is going to be helpful in this kickoff meeting as we build out a list of ideas there that your client and the SMEs and anyone else involved can really focus in on target, so we can determine what solution works best. So there's two things that we're going to consider this morning from chapters 5 and 6, and they come from chapters 5 and then from chapter 6 in that order. What do they need to do, and why aren't they doing it? And as simple as that sounds, that's so crucial to this kickoff meeting process, identifying from that goal what those actions might be. So with that in mind, let's take a look at what Cathy suggests we might need to focus on for this first step. What do they need to do? What do they need to do? And she puts it simply like this: performance improves when people do things differently, not when they know stuff. As Simple as that sounds, that's so key and crucial to this next step. So doing things differently, performing in that way. So what do they need to do? Focusing again on not just having discussions on how do we close knowledge gaps, but more so how do we increase behavior and performance. She suggests doing this in the middle of this kickoff meeting, right? We're still in that conversation with the clients and the SMEs. You already have knowledge statements that you can work off of. What do they need to know? But then turn those into observable actions. Don't do more work than you need to do. Cathy Moore essentially argues for us. If you already have that there, take what you have and transform that into an observable action. Again, all this comes through conversation with these clients and the SMEs. Organize those actions into not just a plethora of actions, but actions and sub-actions. Really focus on subordination. That way we can delineate and figure out, okay, which ones are priority, which ones are top concern that are going to lead to that increased performance. And be specific. Specify. That's what's going to lead to increased performance, is not being vague, not being assuming that all learners will get to where they need to get in terms of that change in performance, because the more specific we are, the more likely it is you'll see that success. And there's going to be so many actions in that conversation from this discussion and kickoff meeting with the SMEs and clients that probably need to prioritize the top 5 or 10 priorities, depending on the size of the project. Cathy argues there. What do they need to do? Figure that out, prioritize, specify, and organize on that action mapping. Because remember, we're still in that process there, stemming off from the main goal. That's going to help. But honestly, look at all these steps. The big piece that is so crucially important is this. As Cathy says on page 88, you lead, the clients and the SMEs participate. Meaning our goal here is not to be the one who is organizing, be the one who is specifying, being the one who's prioritizing. We're just guiding so the clients and the SMEs can see it for themselves, because that's going to get to that main goal of having them see the solution. And so determining what they need to do, as simple as those steps may seem, like that might be a long conversation. That's true. But kind of following those steps and making sure that they are involved in this process. It's not just you telling them what the specific actions are. We're outsiders for most cases, right? We might not know the culture. We might not know the actual performance and behavior challenges that are being faced on the job. They do. Rely on that, lean on that, guide them. But Cathy says, make sure they're participating there. But even beyond that, that's only the first step. And as crucial as identifying the actions may seem, she gets to the next part there in chapter 6, which I would argue is at least just as important, or maybe even more important than identifying the actions themselves. In fact, Cathy's pretty adamant making sure you don't skip this step. If you skip this step, but what we're about to talk about, you might as well just throw out your goal and anything else. And that's this step. We need to identify the barriers between the workers and the business goals, and then brainstorm ways to remove those barriers. How do we prevent those barriers? Why aren't they doing these actions in the first place? Let's get rid of those barriers. But that's complex, because really what we get into at this point is just analysis. We've already done that to some extent, but now we have to dig in as good question and inquiry askers and determine, and help them determine, I should say, why aren't they doing this to begin with? And so if we're going to look for those barriers, we kind of have to categorize things in a certain way. But how do we determine the barriers? Cathy gives us a suggestion. That suggestion is be relentless in the way we approach this, but don't stop asking one question. And that question is, you probably already know it. Why? Why? Keep on asking why, and that's our goal. That's how we guide them into this sense of, well, what are those barriers? It's not our job to already know this. It's to ask those questions why. And as ridiculous as that might seem, that's probably not even as many whys as we really need to ask. But when it comes to asking those questions why, the big why question is, again, why aren't they doing it? And we have to figure out what those barriers are by asking why over and over and over again. One of the objections that she approaches here, and you might have faced this on your own situation, your own job site, what happens when an action is new? They might not be doing it because it was never required in the first place. So how do we shift that conversation on actions and not just information dumping if an action is new? Well, she suggests change the wording this way. What might make this difficult? What's the potential barrier? What's the potential stopping point that might prevent them from doing this the first time? And so whether it's new, whether it's an older practice that has issues, or people on the job aren't doing it, it doesn't really matter. This is something that can be solved through action mapping. Here's what I thought was really helpful and interesting, and this might take some work, but I can see how it would be super helpful. She focuses on having us create a fictional persona, right? Find a situation that maybe is a culmination of multiple workers on the job, and build that out in a fictional way to start thinking about the different barriers that they may face, and try to have to overcome in order to actually do these actions that we identified in the action mapping process. That sounds kind of fun from my English teacher former background there perspective, but that might not be the thing for everyone. But again, you are guiding, you let them create the persona, and just guide them along those lines to really try to determine, what kind of experience might they have, where are they located, what cultural considerations might be there. That persona can then guide and help us figure out, okay, what in that specific situation could those barriers be. We also have to figure out what our role is. Are we going to be a little bit more directive, or are we going to be more open? Cathy suggests if they are more course inclined, we might want to be more directive in how we lead them through going through barrier by barrier by barrier, what could be in the way of stopping these actions from being done. But an open approach might be the case too if they already seem focused on the action rather than information or knowledge being the solution. Being open to hearing their ideas with these different barriers first, instead of just guiding them through the almost checklist she gives us to consider, which we'll look at in just one second. But keep things simple. We're not trying to overwhelm the clients or the SMEs. We're also not trying to overwhelm ourselves. If we're looking at this action map, one action at a time, one category at a time, we don't want to overdo it there. Because again, determining a solution is going to take work, but we really have to look at each step of the puzzle in order to figure out what that solution might be. And here's where things get complicated. I want to discuss these in our discussion tables, and I'd love to hear what you've encountered yourself as it comes down to what these barriers might be and what these might look like. These barrier categories she goes through and suggests are varied, but if we're going to take a more directive approach, starting from the beginning with this first one, she suggests might be more helpful, because you're going to notice there's a little bit of overlap between all of these categories. And again, if you're familiar with the ADDIE process and this analysis stage where we need to determine through inquiry, through just determining where these issues might lie, these categories might sound familiar to you, which that's good. There might be environmental problems, right? Whether those are bad tools that workers are using, the difficult or hard to understand information. Maybe it is related to, pressure or culture, or maybe just they're the wrong person for the job. All those environmental factors may be sort of some of the starting points for the barriers that we're trying to identify here of why aren't they doing it. This one, Cathy puts up toward the beginning as well, because it often gets avoided. There might be some emotionally tricky situations that are causing these barriers to arise, and performance is being stifled or affected by these emotionally tricky situations. She doesn't want us to focus so much on attitude of the workers, but just understanding, the emotional aspect of a task can help us determine a better solution as well. And then the cultural problems. We started with culture at the very beginning of this whole book, right? That cultural challenge is what lies ahead of us in order to actually implement action mapping. But then on the job itself, she makes the asks the question: can learning and development actually address cultural problems? And again, I'd love to hear some of your responses with that, because that's a tough one. How do you go into a project and change organizational beliefs or decisions in order to see a positive outcome? You're probably not going to change everything. You can't. But understanding that those cultural problems could be a barrier, and that's not something necessarily you just provide info dump training for, that's going to at least be helpful from this perspective. But those are just the first three. But she puts those three in the front in that directive approach for a reason. Because the ones we often go to, like skills, something that could be solved with space practice, not knowledge, again, or knowledge itself, again, we're kind of keeping that on the back end, since our goal is not to give an info-heavy course as a solution. But that could also be solved, she suggests, through resources or just communication fixes there. So skill, knowledge, barriers, and even motivation all come after establishing what those environmental problems, emotionally tricky situations, and cultural problems might be. But really, that motivation piece, I look at it as essentially a consequence of all the previous 5 barriers. And we could delineate this in different ways. And that's not to say these are the only barriers that could come up. And there's going to be some overlap there. But an individual's motivation to complete a task on the job that might not be getting done, that performance problem, well, that could be a culmination of all of these other issues: environment and culture, and maybe even lacking skill proficiency. So we need to consider those things as we're having these conversations. But the thing was, I got a kick out of is, with all of those categories, that seems so extensive, and this chapter is fairly long. Cathy says, yeah, that conversation can take place probably in about 10 minutes. I would love to get there myself, and that probably takes a practice individual to ask those questions, why, and be able to determine that. But of course, some of these might be for bigger projects, longer projects, and might take a little bit more work to get down to identifying what those are. But at the end of the day, this is my last piece, and we'll look at those thought questions and discuss these at our tables. Looking at both of these chapters here, what do they need to do, and why aren't they doing it? The main goal still remains the same within this kickoff meeting, and what we talked about last week as well. It's our role to help the clients see solutions, right? Not to tell them what it is, not to identify it for them, but they're active participants, like we said before. And so point out the quick wins. If we have all these actions on the map here, stemming off of that one very clear, measurable goal in the middle, which ones can we solve right away? That can help bring about some positive change, and maybe can affect even other actions as well. Point out the slower changes. Maybe there's not quick wins for all of these actions, but if it's something that's attainable and addressable in a fairly easy way, it's going to take a little bit more time, let's determine what those might be too. But if training is on the horizon, we want to make sure, as Cathy says there on page 132, that training means practice activities. That's going to foreshadowing for the next couple chapters that are coming up here as we look at that next week. Practice activities, how we determine what those might be, not information presentation, right? Activities, engaged and observable aspects to this type of training that may be proposed, maybe, not for sure. But the final result ends up being probably very little training if we go through this analysis process correctly. Again, it's easier said than done, but that's the goal. That's the intent there, to get to that point. And so she leaves us with one thing, and that statement is, this is pretty extensive. This is can be pretty complicated. But as we think about one thing here, she suggests to us pause for a second and think, is this actually hard? Is this process actually hard? Or is it just new? Is it uncomfortable? Because that goes back to the cultural challenge. Maybe an organization just needs to be guided in that way to see the value in action mapping. And same thing with us too. If it seems like it's hard and extensive, well, maybe it's just because it's new, and we need to be able to determine, how we address that. But here's a solution, and then we'll go into our thought questions. If we propagate this hard mindset, our jobs will actually become more satisfying, because we take on that role of performance consultant rather than, course developer or training maker. At least for me personally, I'd feel more satisfied seeing that here were the issues. We figured out what they need to do and why they weren't doing it, and we actually found a solution. And maybe that solution wasn't even training, and then the job could be done after implementing some other changes. That's a big shift in mindset. But if we view it as hard, well, it might be hard, but it certainly is worth it. And so that's chapters 5 and 6, but some things for us to consider before we jump into some discussion tables, because I'd love to hear what your thoughts are going through that section. It was a lot of reading, I know, and I didn't even go over any of the examples there, so hopefully you had a chance to consider those and maybe think about applying them in your own situation. But let's throw out some questions, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. We'll go into those discussion tables and then jump back onto the main stage to have some volunteers share out on what they found. So here is question number 1. What should we do if an action contains words like understand or appreciate? We gave those lists of verbs earlier that Cathy suggested might be observable, but are understand and appreciate observable? And of course, we probably know the answer is probably not to the extent, but what do we do with that? What if that gets proposed as one of the actions that we place on our map there from clients or SMEs? How do we address that in our conversations there? So that's question number 1. Question number 2, why does Cathy have us first focus on the environmental, emotional, and cultural barriers? What effect does that have on this directive approach of trying to ask that question, why, over and over again, to lead us to prioritizing those actions and determining what barriers might be in place of stopping individuals from doing that on-the-job performance in the first place? Why first focus on those 3 elements rather than knowledge, skill, motivation? And I'd love to hear some examples you have from your own perspective and experience. And then lastly, question number 3, how do we avoid analysis paralysis? Because really this is all about analyzing the situation. What do they need to do and why aren't they doing it? But how do we get to and avoid the stage where we just are overwhelmed with the amount of analysis that's before us? And just a hint, Cathy does give us a nice long list in a section that helps us avoid analysis paralysis, but I want to hear what your perspectives are and maybe take a look at some of the options that Cathy gave us as well. So there's questions 1, 2, and 3 for us. We're going to jump into those discussion tables that are labeled exactly that. I'd love to hear your perspectives. If you notice that a table doesn't have anyone at it or has only one other person at it, want to consider those conversations. So if you don't mind jumping in that way, that'd be appreciated. Then we'll come back to the main stage after we take a couple minutes to discuss, and I'll jump around those tables as well and hear what we have to say, because you always bring the awesome insights and nice anecdotes and stories to share. Look forward to hearing that. I will meet you back on the main stage in just a few minutes. Let's discuss. We had our 3 questions. I heard some awesome responses. I want you to be willing to share those out with us. So as we've done before, we'll ask that you raise your hand and share out on what you have to offer there, which I know is a ton. But that first question, as a reminder, we asked, what should we do in a situation where a proposed action contains words like understand or appreciate? Those aren't quite observable. Did you all come up with any solutions that could help us overcome that issue there in the kickoff meeting or conversations like that? I'd love to hear what your perspective was. I did see some at that table, might not have been as popular as the next question we'll look at in a second, but do want to see if we have any considerations there. So what should we do if an action contains words like understand or appreciate? Can we turn that into something observable and helpful? It's kind of interesting with this one, though, because Cathy does offer some suggestions for this type of question. It's not to say that you're not going to have projects that do ask us to think about, understand or appreciate. Those can definitely be things of consideration. Yeah, there we go. Like in the chat, Dana, you're exactly right. What does it look like? What does appreciate look like? What other sub actions, which really will become priority actions later on, are involved in this, process of appreciation or understanding, right? How do we know that they are appreciating? How do we know they're understanding? Again, it's not to say that those aren't wrong starting places, but that's certainly not something we're going to try to address in training. We won't come to any helpful solutions there at all, right? So that again, I think is something that is probably very relatable to on the job in terms of what's proposed for an action, but certainly not going to be very helpful in the long run. Well, if you're dying to get to that next question, again, I don't blame you. Let's take a look at that other question, and that was, why first focus on the environmental, emotional, or cultural barriers? I know that we had some thoughts on that, and I'd love to hear why start with that. Why is that so important? Have you seen that on the job? Have you seen solutions that stem specifically from avoiding these barriers or overcoming these barriers? Please raise your hand. I want to hear from some of us, because I saw several at that table that I know had awesome responses.
Okay, so I'll give it a shot. See if I can explain this. So oftentimes
Yeah.
these things are overlooked, and will go right to training to address a skill, but it might be a computer problem, or um, time management, or uh, just the culture, and those are things that could be fixed. A new computer or different system. Culture problems might be a little bit more difficult. I think some people in the group mentioned that, and we might just try to avoid addressing that
Mhm.
because it's kind of
Yeah.
a big deal. But yeah, having this list
Mhm.
to go through kind of helps us address those things, because it might be a simple fix.
And that's the thing too, right? It's like not well, like, cultural issues might not be a simple fix, but at the same time, like, that's going to be simpler than trying to create a training that's going to do nothing, right? At the same time, and you're right. Like, thinking about culture, like, maybe we try to avoid that because, one, especially if you're coming in from outside an organization and they're your client, you might be hesitant to try to I don't know, come off as critiquing their culture. That's where the why questions come in handy, right? It maybe takes the personal assault away from it. But at this, yeah, that avoiding that's not going to solve the problems, though. If that really is where the issue is coming from. Yeah, really good point there. All right, thank you. Any other thoughts with that? Have you seen that in your own job situation where that solution may stem from something cultural or environmental? I think those would be probably fairly decently easy fixes there, right? Um, but yeah, the touchiness of, well, what if there's a tricky emotional problem? That's not gonna be an easy conversation to have. But again, maybe that's where we become more of guides, rather than identifying the issues for them. If we can get the clients to see the solutions, which they might not want to. And yeah, you're right, Dana. Like, sometimes people don't want to like tell on coworkers, because that could be part of the situation too. Think about this, especially the emotional, tricky problems that Cathy addresses there, like the pressures that others might be feeling. They'll still have to be addressed, but that makes it a lot more difficult, and sometimes maybe we wish it's more of a knowledge gap or a inadequacy with skills, because that might sound easier to address than some of these other options. Yes, definitely. Well, with this whole analysis, because there's so many considerations, the barriers, what they're doing versus why aren't they doing it. But we also brought up that last question there on, there's so much to consider. How do we avoid things like analysis paralysis? I threw out the idea when we were talking in our group that, so I'd love to hear what your thoughts are too, that when you think of the aptitude mapping process, I love it. It's a visual understanding of the goal, the target, and the problems and actions that need to be addressed. But if there's a lot of actions, that can be really overwhelming. How do we avoid that? How do we solve that problem? Are there any easy fixes? Laurel suggesting like time box it, and I think Cathy kind of gets into that too in some ways, right? Like let's figure out, hey, are there some quick wins? Can we solve these problems quicker than others? And then there's going to be some that take more time. I think we mentioned that earlier too, and so maybe that helps us like prioritize a little bit more. And again, it's not even us prioritizing, it's leading the clients and the SMEs to prioritize. And that's exactly what I'm seeing in the chat too, right? Courtney and Dana both like focus on the main ones, prioritize those actions directly related to business goals, which that almost sounds like a Cathy Moore quote there, because I think she does say that, be direct, right? Don't have conversations or questions related to, well, unrelated to what the performance problem is. Don't necessarily ask questions that are going to give you information that might not lead us to those priority solutions, which again, that's hard, especially if it's an organization that's unknown to you. But it can also be hard if it is an organization known to you, and you might not want to speak up on some of those issues that are apparent. Again, letting the client see the solutions could definitely help there. And yeah, Heidi, you bring up a great point too. Focusing on the action that should be demonstrated. Maybe that goes back to that very first question we addressed. What can we actually see? What's going to affect on the job performance? That helps prioritize. And then that's going to help maybe with the further questioning as we ask why. I love those ideas. Any other thoughts or insights there from our table groups? I know we kind of ended that one a little bit later with that third table, but have you seen analysis paralysis take place on your day-to-day that's either affected coming to a training solution or not?
I think I might have missed when like you were talking about the question in regards to the culture change, and can we change the organization's culture as an ID. So what we discussed was that we thought that Cathy Moore doesn't really think that we can as an ID. And then what I contributed was I said I took a like SHRM certification course. SHRM is the Society of so the Society of like Human Resource. I forget what the M stands for. And when I was going through that course, and they were talking about culture changes and shifts in terms of like mergers and acquisitions, they talked about the HR people is the one that are responsible for that culture shift and making sure that it's successful. And they never mentioned learning and development. Like when we did talk about, when we did get to those chapters of in terms of learning and development, it didn't contain anything about culture shifts. So I think as an ID, if I did have to if I was asked to work on something like that, I would probably have to partner with HR to figure out what HR is actually doing to change the culture, and then see how I could contribute. But as of right now, I don't know how I would actually contribute.
Yeah, and that's the thing as well. It depends on your organization. You may feel like you are asked to take on the whole world with the problems and trying to find a solution. But really, again, Cathy's trying to have us through this book focus more on being performance consultants rather than the like course creators or the necessarily solving all the problems ourselves. And so that partnership there could be something super crucial in changing a culture and coming to solutions there. But at the end of the day, even with this meeting, if those cultural barriers are in place, maybe it's just trying to open their eyes that this might fall onto other departments like HR. It's not to push off responsibilities, but again, learning development team can only do so much. That you might not be able to shift the culture, maybe in small ways, but not on a wide scale. Organizational belief and things like that. And kind of related to that too. Laurel mentioned, maybe interviewing learners, giving you data on the problems, because the leaders may be kind of out of touch with what the cultural issues are. Going to the learners directly who would suggested that they go through a training, they might have some insights on, what the root cause could be, and then bringing forward that to your clients. That could change the game without you having to change the culture, but you could play a part in that and having them see what the solutions might be.
Yeah.
Great
And,
points.
yeah, and in terms of like leadership change, I think naturally people just find other jobs when they don't agree with the leadership when like new leadership comes in, because I've experienced that myself, and I actually left as well. Like every week it was like a new person. It was like, who's quitting this week? Because there was a new president of the college that I worked for. So I think it kind of naturally happens if you don't kind of agree with the vision of leadership or the values, or you just don't like the way the culture is going. People tend to naturally just, pack up and leave.
Yeah, and that's a sad reality too, right? Because all of these, I mean, again, action mapping is the way we determine what these problems are. That's not going to solve every single organizational issue, but bringing those things to light definitely could help, but it might not. You can't change someone's mind for them, but we can do our part as performance consultants to try to maybe get them there. But yeah, I love the suggestions I'm seeing in the chat. And I'd love to discuss that further too at discussion tables. But thank you so much, Debbie, for those insights there. I think that's helpful to hear and see, especially from your own perspective of what you've witnessed, unfortunately, when it comes down to changing some of those behaviors or cultural situations. Focus on where we're headed and where we're going from there. We talked all about the kickoff meeting and how crucial it is. We're still kind of in that zone right now, determining the goal, prioritizing those actions, and determining why aren't they doing it. But the next steps are, what, in chapters 7-8, again, a little lengthy, but I think we can find some helpful moments there to figure out what types of, not actions, but activities could be used if training is the solution, if training is the way we solve that problem. And so again, check the Slack for updates. I'll be posting the replay there as well. We've been having our ID community reading hour every Thursday, so you've been able to join us there on Thursday at 5 p.m. Pacific time. Then that's been helpful, I think, for some who either aren't able to make it to these sections or just to make sure we get that reading done before we meet today. So as always, really appreciate all of the responses and engagement with your ideas there, but behaviors or cultural situations in an organization. But once again, thank you so much for being here, and we will be picking back up as we get getting closer to the middle of the text there in this action mapping process. We're still in the discussion phase with that kickoff meeting, but there's some next steps if training is required for us to consider. All right, I will see you next week, and I'll be in the discussion tables right now to discuss things further with you, or just to chat a little bit about other things as well. Thanks for coming. We'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody.